Imagine a moment where a single decision determines who lives and who dies. Not in a movie, not in a fictional thriller, but in a moral puzzle that philosophers have debated for centuries. This famous thought experiment, often called the trolley problem, forces people to confront a disturbing question about responsibility and morality. What should someone do when every possible choice leads to harm? In classrooms around the world, students are asked to imagine themselves in impossible situations where quick decisions carry life-and-death consequences. These scenarios are not meant to shock for entertainment. They are designed to reveal something deeper about how humans think about justice. Behind every answer lies a set of values about fairness, responsibility, and the limits of moral action. What makes these dilemmas so powerful is that there is rarely a universally accepted answer. Instead, each response opens a door to deeper questions about ethics, human nature, and the meaning of doing the right thing. This exploration of moral reasoning is not simply an academic exercise. It reflects the kinds of choices societies face in politics, medicine, law, and everyday life. The scenario begins with a runaway trolley racing down a railway track at terrifying speed. The brakes have failed, and the driver realizes with horror that 5 workers are standing further down the track. They have no time to escape. If nothing changes, the trolley will crash into them within seconds. In that desperate moment, the driver notices something important: a side track that splits off to the right. If the trolley is redirected onto this alternative track, the 5 workers will survive. But there is a catch. On that side track stands a single worker who would be struck instead. Suddenly, the situation becomes a moral crossroads. Turning the trolley means actively choosing to sacrifice one person in order to save 5 others. Doing nothing means allowing 5 people to die even though there was a way to reduce the loss of life. Most people instinctively believe that saving the greater number is the better outcome. Yet even as they make that choice, many feel a sense of discomfort. The decision may seem logical, but emotionally it still feels troubling. At first glance, the reasoning behind saving 5 instead of 1 appears straightforward. If the goal is to minimize harm, redirecting the trolley seems like the responsible action. After all, losing 1 life is tragically better than losing 5. Many people justify their answer using simple arithmetic. 5 lives outweigh 1. This way of thinking focuses entirely on the outcome of the decision. The morality of the action is judged by the consequences it produces. But something interesting happens when the scenario changes slightly. When people are presented with different versions of the dilemma, their confidence begins to waver. What seemed like an obvious moral rule suddenly becomes more complicated. Human beings do not rely on logic alone when making ethical decisions. Emotions, instincts, and social values also influence how we judge right and wrong. The trolley problem reveals that our moral thinking is not always consistent. In some situations, we emphasize results, while in others, we focus on the nature of the action itself. This tension between outcomes and principles sits at the heart of many ethical debates. Now imagine a different situation involving the same runaway trolley. This time you are not the driver but a bystander standing on a bridge above the track. Below you, the trolley is once again speeding toward 5 workers who cannot escape. Next to you stands a very large man leaning over the railing. Suddenly, a shocking idea crosses your mind. If this man were pushed off the bridge onto the track, his body would stop the trolley before it reached the workers. The 5 people below would survive, but the man would die instantly. Logically, the numbers remain the same as before: 1 life sacrificed to save 5. Yet when people hear this version of the story, their reactions change dramatically. Very few are willing to push the man. The discomfort that existed in the first scenario now becomes overwhelming. Even though the outcome saves more lives, the act itself feels deeply wrong. The idea of physically pushing someone to their death crosses a moral line many people refuse to cross. These 2 versions of the trolley dilemma expose a powerful conflict between different ways of thinking about morality. In the first case, people often focus on the result. Fewer deaths mean the decision was justified. In the second case, attention shifts to the nature of the act itself. Pushing someone to their death feels like murder, regardless of the benefits that might follow. Philosophers describe this clash using 2 major ethical frameworks. One approach, known as consequentialism, judges actions by their outcomes. According to this view, the morally correct choice is the one that produces the best overall result. The other approach focuses on moral duties and rules. From this perspective, certain actions are simply wrong, even if they lead to better consequences. Killing an innocent person deliberately may fall into that forbidden category. The trolley problem therefore becomes more than just a strange thought experiment. It becomes a window into the deeper structure of human moral reasoning and the difficult balance between logic, emotion, and principle. To explore these moral ideas further, philosophers often introduce another scenario involving a hospital emergency room. Imagine a doctor facing 6 patients after a devastating accident. 5 of them have injuries that are serious but treatable. With proper medical care, they could all recover and return to normal lives. The 6th patient, however, is critically wounded. Treating this one patient would require the doctor's full attention for many hours. During that time, the other 5 patients would not receive the care they desperately need, and they would likely die. The doctor must decide how to spend limited time and resources. If the doctor focuses on the 5 moderately injured patients, they will survive, but the severely injured patient will die. If the doctor dedicates all efforts to the single patient in critical condition, the other 5 lives will be lost. Once again, the question appears: should one life be sacrificed so that several others may live? Most people instinctively choose to save the greater number of patients. The reasoning seems consistent with the earlier trolley scenario, where saving 5 people appeared morally preferable. Now consider a much more unsettling version of the hospital dilemma. This time you are not simply an emergency doctor deciding how to allocate time. Instead, you are a transplant surgeon with 5 patients who each need a different organ to survive. One requires a heart transplant, another needs a lung, another a kidney, another a liver, and the 5th patient needs a pancreas. Without these organs, all 5 will die within days. Unfortunately, no donors are available. Just as the situation begins to feel hopeless, a healthy man enters the hospital for a routine checkup. He has no idea about the crisis unfolding nearby. The surgeon realizes something shocking. If this healthy person were sacrificed, his organs could be used to save all 5 patients. One death could potentially prevent 5 others. From a purely numerical standpoint, the outcome appears similar to the earlier scenarios. Yet almost everyone feels an immediate sense of moral horror at the idea. This reaction reveals something fascinating about human moral instincts. When people imagine turning the trolley onto the side track, many are willing to make the difficult choice because it seems unavoidable. But the idea of deliberately killing an innocent person to harvest their organs feels fundamentally different. Even though the number of lives saved would be the same, the action itself seems morally unacceptable. This suggests that human beings do not evaluate ethical decisions solely through calculations of benefit and harm. Instead, we also consider intentions, fairness, and the rights of individuals. The healthy patient did nothing to deserve being sacrificed. Treating that person merely as a resource for others feels deeply unjust. These reactions challenge the idea that moral decisions should always be based on maximizing positive outcomes. Sometimes people believe that certain actions should never be performed, regardless of how beneficial the results might appear. The discussions surrounding these dilemmas highlight 2 major traditions in moral philosophy. The first tradition focuses on consequences. According to this view, the morality of an action depends on the results it produces. If a decision leads to greater overall happiness or less suffering, then it can be considered morally justified. The second tradition focuses on duties, principles, and rights. Supporters of this perspective argue that some actions are inherently wrong, even if they lead to positive outcomes. Killing an innocent person intentionally may violate a fundamental moral rule that cannot be broken for the sake of convenience or efficiency. The tension between these 2 frameworks has shaped philosophical debates for centuries. Real-world issues in law, medicine, politics, and technology often reflect the same conflict. Should society prioritize the greatest overall benefit, or should it protect certain moral boundaries no matter the cost? One of the most influential philosophical approaches, built on the idea of consequences, is called utilitarianism. This theory argues that the morally correct action is the one that maximizes overall happiness and minimizes suffering. The concept gained widespread attention through the work of the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. Bentham believed that human behavior is guided by two powerful forces, pleasure and pain. According to his view, individuals naturally seek happiness and try to avoid suffering. Because of this basic human tendency, Bentham argued that laws and moral decisions should aim to produce the greatest possible happiness for the greatest number of people. This simple but powerful idea became a cornerstone of modern ethical theory. Utilitarian thinking has influenced debates about public policy, criminal justice, economics, and social welfare for more than 2 centuries. Bentham's theory was revolutionary because it attempted to bring a kind of calculation into moral decision-making. Instead of relying only on tradition or authority, he suggested that actions could be evaluated by considering their overall impact on human happiness. In theory, one could weigh the pleasures and pains caused by different choices and determine which option creates the most positive outcome. This approach treats every person's happiness as equally important. The suffering of one individual cannot simply be ignored if it contributes to someone else's benefit. However, critics quickly notice that this idea raises difficult questions. Can happiness really be measured in a precise way? Is it possible to compare different people's experiences of pleasure and pain? And should moral decisions really resemble mathematical calculations? These questions reveal both the strength and the challenge of utilitarian thinking. Philosophical discussions often move beyond imaginary scenarios to examine real events from history. One famous legal case from the 19th century forced society to confront the same moral dilemmas explored in the trolley problem. The case, known as R.V. Dudley and Stevens, involved a group of sailors stranded at sea after their ship was destroyed during a violent storm. With no food and almost no fresh water, the survivors drifted helplessly in a small lifeboat for weeks. As the days passed, their situation grew more desperate. Hunger and exhaustion pushed them toward a terrible decision that would later shock the world and spark intense legal and philosophical debate. After many days without food, the sailors began to realize that none of them might survive if nothing changed. One of the crew members, a young cabin boy, had already become extremely weak and ill, according to later testimony. 2 of the sailors eventually decided that killing the boy and using his body for food might allow the others to live. It was a horrifying choice, but in their desperate state, they believed it might be the only chance of survival. They carried out the act and consumed the boy's remains. A few days later, a passing ship rescued them. What seemed like a desperate survival decision at sea quickly became a legal and moral controversy once the men returned to civilization. When the sailors were brought to trial, the central issue was not whether the killing had occurred. The facts were largely undisputed. Instead, the court had to decide whether extreme necessity could justify taking an innocent life. The defense argued that the men acted to preserve their own survival. Without that decision, all of them might have died. From a purely consequential perspective, sacrificing one person could be seen as saving several others. However, the prosecution argued that allowing such reasoning would create a dangerous precedent. If necessity justified killing the weakest person in desperate circumstances, society would be accepting a principle that undermines the value of human life. The judges ultimately rejected the defense of necessity and ruled that the killing was still murder. Debates raised by these stories continue to shape modern discussions about ethics and justice. From medical decisions about life-saving treatments to government policies that affect millions of people, societies constantly face choices where every option carries moral consequences. The trolley problem, the transplant surgeon dilemma, and the tragic survival case at sea all reveal the same underlying tension. Should we focus on achieving the best overall outcome, even if it requires harming someone? Or should certain moral rules remain absolute, regardless of the results? Philosophers from Aristotle to Emmanuel can't have offered different answers to these questions. Yet the debate remains unresolved. Perhaps